sincerely thank her for making the trip all the way down from Hillsdale. I think you will find that she's full of knowledge and insight, and she did indicate that it'd be great to have a question and answer at the end, so please be thinking about your questions. But to introduce Dr. O'Toole, she is the Assistant Provost for K-12 Education at Hillsdale, where she leads Hillsdale's work in K-12 education, including the K-12 Education Office and Hillsdale Academy. Prior to joining Hillsdale, she was the founding headmaster at Founders Classical Academy of Leander, a classical charter school serving 700 students in grades K through 12. And if I'm not mistaken, correct me if I'm wrong, Dr. O'Toole, but I believe she was a member of the first graduating class of Hillsdale Academy, the second graduating class of Hillsdale Academy, which is the very school from which our own third grade teacher, Ms. Berzer, also later graduated. In addition to her role at Hillsdale, Dr. O'Toole also serves on the board of the Classic Learning Test, which our scholars, you may recall, just took a few weeks ago. Columbus Classical Academy is a direct and constant beneficiary of the work that Dr. O'Toole and her team have done and are doing in K-12 education. And as you might imagine, she knows well the challenges and encouragements, the fear and fun of being part of a founding effort, both as a student, a teacher, and also as an administrator, and now as an executive. So we're enormously grateful to have her here to share with us the wisdom of experience and insight into all that Hillsdale is doing to help restore education in our nation. So please welcome Dr. O'Toole.
Thank you. Well, thanks for having me. Can you guys hear me okay? Yeah, it's been such a pleasure to spend the afternoon here at Columbus Classical Academy. I have heard about this school all the time, regularly since it opened, and I hear about it. I hear about it all the time up there in Hillsdale, and so I'm happy to have a chance to see it myself. One of the parts about my job that I do not enjoy is I'm not in schools as much anymore, except as a visitor. So that's what I get to do. I don't get to teach, but I get to visit, and today was a delightful day. I'll give you a little bit of background on Hillsdale College, Hillsdale College's work in K-12 education. And then I'll give you a little bit of information about classical education and what it means and how it's related to progressive education, which is what dominates American K through 12 education these days. And then I'm available for questions. I really like questions. They help me make sure that I'm saying something that's helpful to the audience. I founded a school, and so I've received a lot of difficult questions in my life. So have at it, and I'll be helpful if I can. So let me explain about Hillsdale College. Hillsdale College is nearly 180 years old. It is a private college, a liberal arts college up in Michigan, about 4 hours north of here. Hillsdale College has a national reputation and a national following, due in part to its independence. It doesn't take government money, and it doesn't count its students by race. And so in addition to serving about 1,400 undergraduate and graduate students, it's become kind of a principled place teaching the principles of freedom to Americans across the country. It produces a newsletter called Imprimis, which you may have seen before, which goes out monthly to 6 or 7 million Americans, and we host conferences and things all over the country. We think of ourselves as a teaching institution because we are a college, and our primary work is with the undergraduate and graduate students at Hillsdale, but if there's something that we know that we can teach to a larger audience, we feel some pressure to teach it. And so we do that. Hillsdale has free online courses, which it's been building up over the last decade or so. Many millions of people take Hillsdale's online courses. They're really excellent and kind of fun. And we also, through the work of my office, teach K through 12 schools, what it means to pursue the education of a child with excellence. And so that's the work of our office. We have 2 levels at which we work with schools. We have member schools, and these are schools that we have worked with since their inception. And we at the office are responsible for all of the training of their board members, their leader, their teachers, and we provide them with a curriculum, and they're coming up to Hillsdale all the time for conferences. And then we have many dozens of curriculum schools, like Columbus Classical Academy, which have a license to use our curriculum, which has been developed at Hillsdale College for 30 years. It's the product of professors at the college, teachers in some of our best schools, and our own team, which is made up of former teachers, coming together to think about what does a child need to learn over the course of his or her years from about age 5 to age 18. And how can we provide that scope and sequence to a school in a way that helps the school build upon the child's previous knowledge and conduct the course of their education with an intentional plan, rather than just chopping and changing from teacher to teacher over the course of the year. So we're pleased to have provided curriculum to Columbus Classical Academy, and my visit to the school today showed just how much they've built over the course of just a year. I've seen many schools in their inception, and this one is polished and serious about its work and thoughtful and doing quite well, in my opinion. Let me say a little bit about the why behind this work that we do, and then I'll describe classical education briefly to you and then welcome some questions. I think it's true that most of American parents, teachers, most of America itself has kind of forgotten the purpose of education. We think today primarily in terms of preparing a child for a particular career, a particular course of life. We think of education as primarily training, and we've forgotten how to conceive of education broadly. We've forgotten the connection between what a child is taught and the development of that child's soul, their whole person. Not just what exact job they're going to do when they grow up, but who are they going to become as a result of the schooling that they have had. Now, of course, the most important forces in a child's life are that child's parents. No one knows children better or loves children as well as the people who are raising them. And that, I think, is another problem common in American education today. We've forgotten about the knowledge and the love of the parent, and instead we've conceived of education as something that ought to be pursued by a team of experts, a group of people who are trained in whatever methods are necessary to educate a child for a specific career. So you've seen a focus on career preparation, a focus on pursuing a specific end for a child and channeling a child's course of study for the purpose of pursuing that particular end. And then you've seen a tendency to say to the people who are bringing that child to school, you don't need to do much more than drop off and pick up. We can handle the rest. We're trained educators. We know what we're doing. And this has proven to be pretty wrong-headed. If you look at the state of American education today, it is no secret that some very basic things that everyone agrees children need to know are not happening in a lot of places. Many American fourth graders cannot read at grade level. Many American school children cannot do mathematics without the aid of a calculator. They lack the attention spans to read anything of substance for more than a few minutes, and they don't have the habits of mind and the personal experience to pursue learning because they're used to having things given to them in quick snapshots. And so they lack both the habits and also the skills that are required for learning, for becoming an educated person. And if you lack the habits of mind to learn, your learning will be stultified at a very low level. This has nothing to do with students' intelligence. This has nothing to do with students' innate abilities. This has everything to do with a wrong-headed approach to schooling. The good news is that the antidote to that is common sense. The antidote to that is something that any parent, any person who takes a few minutes to think about can recognize as true just by considering it. And that's what classical education and the work of Hillsdale College is all about. we're reminding American teachers, we're reminding American school headmasters and parents too of the things that we used to know about how to go about the education of a child. And then we're making available to those teachers and those schools the resources that they need in order to do that work. Nothing that we produce at the college is really an invention of the college. We're just keepers of a tradition that has existed for a very long time, and we know how teachers need it to be delivered to them so that they can deliver it to the students. And so we think of ourselves as serving at the college the same mission which schools like Columbus Classical Academy are serving. We're not inventing something, we're reminding someone of something in the service of what is true. So how do we think about classical education? Sometimes when we have board members at Hillsdale schools come up to the college, I give a talk for them called What is Classical Education? And it goes on for 3 hours. So we're not going to do that today. I'm just going to tell you the headings of the talk so you can see sort of what kinds of things we talk about, and then I'll answer some questions about it if that would be helpful. You've probably noticed, if you've talked to people about classical education before, that some of them like to go on for a bit. This is one of the faults of classical educators. It's beautiful, right? It means they really are thinking about what they're doing, but it's kind of like asking a graduate student to describe their dissertation to you and then being like stuck in a chair for 45 minutes straight. It's helpful to have just sort of some quick ways of thinking about it. And then, of course, it's like all good things worthy of deeper thought and deeper explanation. I think the first and easiest way to think about it is classical education is about tried and true methods of teaching and tried and true curriculum. And so if we're going to take time in the K through 12 years, it's only 13 years, it's not actually that much time, even though it might feel like it to the students who are going through it. It's not actually that much time. If we're going to take the time to do something, it better be something that's tried and true. It better be something that we know works. It better be something that is worthy of our time and attention and that will serve us well over the course of our lives. We know what these things are. Classical education does look to the past. It doesn't look to the past because it loves old stuff rather than new stuff. It looks to the past because there's a wealth of knowledge to be gained from the past about what works. So it turns out cursive handwriting is a really effective way to help students with their spelling, among other things. So we're going to do cursive handwriting because the benefits have been demonstrated. It turns out the concrete to pictorial to abstract approach that we use in Singapore math does wonders for students to develop number sense. And it's a lot more effective than the math curriculum I had in school, which just taught me to memorize the pattern that the teacher would put in place, spit out the right answer, having not actually understood anything at any depth about what I was doing. It turns out that students who have access to a calculator from a very young age do not develop number sense, and that they cannot think. It's actually true that mathematical thinking leads to the ability for abstract thinking, and so it doesn't just impair their ability to think properly in mathematics and understand deeply what's happening, it actually impairs their ability to think abstractly about anything. And so we're not going to do that. We're going to do our math facts and have them memorized and know them like the back of our hand. And so that's an example of how we think about what students are doing in a classical education. They have to be things that have stood the test of time, and they have to be things that work. And the good news, as I said previously about those things, is a lot of them just make sense. There's common sense makes it happen that way. The next way that I would think about classical education is it's a well-rounded education. It's an education in the liberal arts and sciences, in the subjects that helps a human being become free and independent. And free doesn't mean free to do whatever you want necessarily. It means free to do the right things. The kind of person who's shaped and formed over the course of his or her education and who's naturally inclined to do the kinds of things which will make him or her happy. And we think that those things can be known because we think that human beings are a certain kind of thing. And despite all of our differences in this room and across the country, we are at our heart the same kind of creature. We all have a body and we all have a soul, and we are all inclined in the same direction, even though the path there may be different for each of us. And so it's an education that equips us for freedom and happiness, but it's a well-rounded education too. We're not just going to study the humanities. We're going to study the sciences too. One of the worst things that I would hear when my school was young was little kids, like second grade, saying, "Dr. O'Toole, I'm not a math person. I've never been a math person. You know, I'm a letters person. You know, I've always loved reading books, but math, science, not my thing." This child's like 7, right? And they've already made up their mind about an entire body of human knowledge not being available to them based on what? Like a random test that they were given last year? Some weird thing that their aunt said to them one time? You know, you're a human being, which means you are a humanities and sciences human being. You have natural curiosity about the world, the human part of the world and the non-human part of the world. And through our well-rounded liberal arts education, you are going to receive a solid foundation of knowledge in all of that stuff. If at the end of it, you have done a very good job with everything, going all the way up to calculus and astronomy, which you can do, tiny people, and Shakespeare and philosophy, you can do all of these things. If at the end of that, you decide you want to spend the rest of your life not studying mathematics, okay, fine. But you have to have learned that. You have to have learned mathematics, and you have to have learned about yourself before you make that decision. And it takes a really long time to do that. So you have to do it in the K through 12 years. The next way that I would think about classical education, this is number 3 of 4, this is number 3, is classical education is going to teach you the skills, the knowledge, and then the habits or virtues of an educated person. So if you go to an excellent classical school, then you are going to receive an education in the skills that you need in order to be a successful student. And think about what those skills are. We already talked about reading. Got to be able to read to do anything. Got to be able to do some math, numeracy, to do anything. What's some other stuff that you have to be able to do, the skills that you have to have in order to be a student? You have to be able to study. And you have to know the difference between sitting on your bed and looking passively at a sheet of information and actually studying that information in a way that deepens your understanding of it or your knowledge of it. That's a skill. And it's kind of hard to learn. It has to be sort of taught explicitly. And another great skill, which people don't realize is a skill, is listening. And this is especially true of little kids in school, right? It has to be taught explicitly because the appearance of someone who is listening in class and the appearance of someone who is not listening at all is basically identical. And you might not know that you're not listening unless someone has actually told you listening is a skill and here are the things that you can do in your head to make sure that you are listening. Okay, so we're going to teach all of these skills explicitly and well because they are the foundation of everything else. Okay, then knowledge, right? You have to learn stuff in school. We're not just learning skills. And this is another tendency that we see in non-classical schools. They teach skills in a vacuum. And there's no actual meat on those bones. So yeah, sure, they learn to read ad nauseum and they memorize their stuff ad nauseum, but there's not really anything interesting happening there. They don't learn any real detail about history. They don't ever get to read any exciting books. No one ever gives them an interesting science lesson. It's all just memorization of stuff, you know, and then the teaching of skills in a vacuum. Turns out, studies have shown this obvious thing. You have to be like doing knowledge and skill together. So if you're practicing the decoding of English words, which is a reading skill, and then you have the example of your parent reading to you some awesome book in the evenings, that is going to give you motivation and excitement about developing the skill of reading, more than the phonics reader that you're practicing in school, which just says something kind of boring, like frog can jump, jump, frog, jump. It was my first book that I read. It was really boring, but I remember the pictures. Okay, so skills, right? And then knowledge on top of those skills. There is an incredible amount of information about the world that children can learn and should learn in order to become educated people. And then virtue or habits, right? You don't just come to school to have your head filled with stuff. Over the course of the time that you are in school, you learn profound things about what is the right way to be and what is the wrong way to be. This is true of every child. Do you kids remember when you were really little, you would just stare? Or have you noticed this about little kids? Like usually 5 and under, they just stare at adults. Like they'll just stand there and look at you, like unblinking. And like really little ones, like my kids, will do that. Why are they staring? They're always staring at adults, and even more interesting than adults is like kids who are like 5 to 7 years older than they are. They're fascinated because they're trying to figure out what's coming next. They're trying to figure out what they're going to be like. So when you send your child to a school, you're sending them to a collection of people, both students and adults, who are forming for that child a set of examples of how to be. And they could be good examples, they could be bad examples, but they are going to be examples. And your child's entire moral universe is going to be formed in part by these people that he or she is spending the days with. And that's true of you as parents too, and everyone they see over the weekend and at the grocery store and everything, but especially the people at school. Because that's a big activity. It's a lot of time. A lot of important things are happening at school. And so we think in a classical school, since we're learning how to be from going to school, why don't we actually do some thinking about and talking with each other about how to be? What kind of person do you want to become? What kind of person should you become if you want to be happy? And so the curriculum is not just the acquisition of knowledge, the filling of the child's brain, but it's the cultivation of the child's character. Teaching the child the habits that will make him or her a happy person, and the virtues that he or she needs to acquire for happiness: courage, generosity, friendship, moderation. So we're going to talk about these things over the course of a child's K through 12 years and give them a kind of a vision of what a happy, thriving human life looks like. And then they get to practice it in their own way. Childhood takes courage. It takes an incredible amount of courage to be a child because you're different every year. Can you imagine? You kind of remember it probably, but like it's so weird to be an adult because you are basically what you're going to be next year. But when you're a kid, who knows what could happen? You could be 3 inches taller. You could not grow at all. You could change what you like. Your friendship could change. It takes an incredible amount of courage to go through that and go through that well. And so let's talk about what is the virtue of courage and how can we cultivate it and how will help you. Okay, final way in which to think about classical education, and then I welcome your questions. Classical education is preparation for citizenship in a free republic. We are, Aristotle says, political animals. And what he means by that is that we are made to live with each other. It is not a happy human life to be alone. Have you guys seen the movie Castaway ever? I really like Tom Hanks, and I really like the movie Castaway because it's a depiction of what an entirely isolated human life is like. He's on that island for, I don't know how long, but many years. And he learns all the stuff that one would have to learn to survive on a tropical island alone. He can fish, and he's got his source of water, and he's got his source of clothing and his shelter. But he's not exactly fully human. He's not exactly living a fully human life because his almost all of his time is spent providing for his daily needs. It's a very kind of like low, his focus is a very low focus, like just making sure his body doesn't die. And he has no one to talk to except for Wilson, the volleyball, who doesn't talk back. You know the scene where Wilson floats away on the raft and he's like, it's like his mother has died or something. It's like the worst thing ever. Because that was his companionship. And it wasn't real companionship, but he was driven somehow deep inside to have some kind of community with this person. Now, what if Wilson had been a real person and a friend? What could they have done for each other? Well, they could have had conversation about real stuff other than like, where are we going to get the fish for today? And Aristotle says the real stuff that we talk about and the moment when we're in that conversation with each other about real stuff, that is the highest human activity. And the real stuff is what's good, what's bad, what's better, what's worse, how should we live? Is this just or unjust? Right? When we're able to have conversation with each other about that kind of thing and do so well, learning and teaching at the same time, that is the highest human activity. And so we, as people who do not live alone on an island with a volleyball, have to, for our own happiness, and also for the happiness of our children and our children's friends and their friends, try to create a kind of community where that kind of conversation is possible, for our own happiness. Citizenship in a free republic requires human beings who are capable of having that kind of conversation with each other in a productive way. The good of a political community is the good of every individual with it, and that lies in cultivating among people a sense of curiosity and being able to articulate your ideas, have discussions with each other, have your ideas corrected when they're wrong, and truly have them corrected, not just pretend, And so there's persuasion and there's deliberation and there's thought about what is the good life, like how should we be thinking about stuff here? And that's the promise of America. And that's the kind of thing that ought to be going on in America and isn't really very much these days. So what's the solution? Well, it's teach young people to be knowledgeable, to be virtuous, and to pursue the right ends, right? For their own sake, but also for the people who are around them. Because we cannot live happily in isolation. And so a classical education, I think, rightly understood, although it is not a politicized education that takes its bearings from whatever debate is going on the news right now, it is a debate that helps people think about living together well. It is an education that helps people think about living together well. And in that case, in that sense, I think it's a political education. But that's not what people mean when they say the word political. Okay, there you go. There's a little bit about classical education and who knows what else. Is that helpful? What other questions do you have? Yes, ma'am.
What would you say is the role or what is the relationship properly understood of faith in a classical context?
That's a good question. So most of the schools that Hillsdale works with, most of the member schools are charter schools. And that means that they go about their work without bringing religion into the public schooling world, so to speak. And I was a principal of a really big charter school, and the work that went on in that school was beautiful. In a high sense of the word, like it was really like excellent what was going on. The teachers were amazing, and the curriculum is amazing. One interesting thing about that school is there was a Catholic school down the road, and after a couple of years, we started getting a ton of our students from that Catholic school. And when I would talk to the parents, I'd be like, what are you doing? Like, why are you putting your kids in a public school? They'd say, well, my child is asking better questions about the world and about God because of this curriculum than he or she was at the local Catholic school. Because the Catholic school, at least that one, was not really doing anything different than a traditional public school, except wearing uniforms and doing some chapel in the mornings and stuff. But it wasn't a robust curriculum, And I think that's, I have a kind of a thing about Catholic education. Because I went to a Catholic college, and so I know like the Catholic Church is the reason why we have this curriculum in large part. And so it's very stupid that the Catholic schools are not teaching it. But that's for another time. So I guess the answer to the question is, I think that to be educated, your education has to be able to help you answer the ultimate questions, right? And the ultimate questions are questions about the divine, right? And I think this curriculum does that. And I think it can especially do that in a religious setting, although I wouldn't hesitate to say that, students are learning some of the deepest things even in our charter schools. What other questions do y'all have?
Make her work, guys.
I'm ready. Yes, sir.
How, in your experience, does getting this kind of education affect our young students' ability to interact with their friends and peers who are not getting that?
Yeah, I can tell you stories about that. I'll tell you about Max. Poor Max. He's graduating from college this year. And he's like, I talk about him all the time, and I don't think he knows it. But he was like, just what you want, Okay, so Max comes in to our school as a 7th grader. And he's part of a big family that takes education seriously, but they've been homeschooling and they had a lot of kids, and it wasn't happening quite with the rigor that it should have. And they would be the first to admit this. And Max is one of 7 kids, and he's wicked smart. He's the smartest of all of his siblings. Like, his ability to do well in school and his like quickness of brain is just off the charts. And he's a complete terrible kid. Like, he's always in my office all the time for doing stupid stuff that none of it was malicious. It was all just like he was bored and acting out and making a scene and being very unhelpful. I was like, Max, you are causing major problems. Just stupid uniform infractions and like testing the teacher to see if they'd notice and whatever. Direct your energies toward learning, Max. Focus. And he lacked some of the skills. His brain was great, but he lacked some of the skills. Okay, so over the course of 3 years, we got Max in line. And we did it by being quite tough on him because he needed it. He was a very strong personality. And we weren't harsh or anything, but we were very clear. Like, if you do this, this will be the consequence. And then he gets the consequence. If you do this again, there will be another one. And then the other one comes. And so he got to the point where this brilliant, handsome, lovely child was nearly expelled from the school because he could not get himself in order. He could not do the right thing. And then his mother, the way the school worked is if you get yourself to that point in the disciplinary system, your mom or your dad has to come back to school with you and follow you around for the day. It's very effective. I apologize for suggesting this here because they might do it now, but what it did is it showed Max, first of all, it's very embarrassing as a seventh grade boy to have your mom follow you around all day. And the mom was like, Max, this is amazing. Like, you could be paying attention to this stuff instead of getting all these disciplinary infractions and being in Dr. O'Toole's office. So she was kind of like, shape up, buddy. And that kind of like brought him back. And so by the end of his 9th grade year, or his 8th grade year, he was like amazing model kid for the school. He was like showing up every day, and he's like tall and handsome, and he had his amazing uniform on. And he would even like dress up the uniform a little bit and make sure his like tie was extra straight, and like go around and like tell the other boys. But he was still fun and normal. Like, he wasn't like nerdy and weird. He was like amazing. And all the little kids would watch him. They'd be like, we want to be like Max. And they'd be like, yeah, be like Max. So that's kind of the culture that started developing in our school, especially among the boys. And I think when you have a K-12 school, you can really test the health of the school by looking at like the 9th and 10th grade boys. Because if you can get them doing what they're supposed to be doing, that's great. That's a sign of health. And that's the kind of thing that this education cultivated, because Max at least needed a challenge. Nothing hard had ever been given to him before. Or he'd always been able to pretend to be doing it properly, and no one had held him accountable. So he had to learn to respect what we were doing and respect himself for doing it well. And then he was like, I have something worthy to spend my time on, and I'm going to do it. So the whole school kind of became that over a few years. It takes years, you know, but it started heading in that direction, and that was our culture. And then we noticed the kids from the local public school would try to come to our dances. And it wasn't a good mixture. Like, the way that they wanted to dance at the dances was not what we wanted to do, the way they wanted to dress, the way that they thought about social activity was not appropriate for their age. And we had this amazing culture of like dressing up and looking nice and swing dancing and having fun and dating in like a healthy, normal way, you know, and so you do see a difference, you know, especially with the phones. That's another thing. Like, even then, 10 years ago, the fact that they did not have a phone on their person at all times really turned them into a different kind of teenager after just a year. Because everyone else was just glued to the thing and living in this alternative virtual world while living in the real world. And the kids who came to our school, they were living in the real world, you know? And they had attention spans to prove it, and they could look you in the eye as an adult and as a fellow student, you know, and like actually talk to you for more than a few minutes. So it does change the students. And I think it's important that they don't develop like a superiority, like haughtiness, you know. But I think once they get into the high school, they can start to tell like what I'm doing is good for me, you know. Yes, sir.
You know, unfortunately, you see a lot of young people walking around with their telephone all the time.
Yeah.
As a matter of fact, they bump into people. Am I wrong in thinking that those kind of actions by the young people using that phone all the time leads them to become an isolationist, as you described?
Yeah. No, I think it does. There's this new book about this. It's by, I think he's primarily a journalist. His name is Jonathan Haidt, Haidt, and it's called The Anxious Generation. And it's a kind of social science-y book, in part. It's a popular book, but it studies the effects of access to social media, phones, on children over the course of a long period of time. And it demonstrates this thing that we all know. It makes them more anxious. It makes them unhappy. They have a kind of an addiction to, I mean, we do too, right? As adults, you have to fight it all the time. Like, they have a kind of an addiction to it. It distracts you because you're living in the world that's on your phone and your social media while you're interacting with other people. And he has some recommendations at the end of that book about like policies that we should make, not just as schools, but as like a country. It should be like, don't give your kid a cell phone until they're like 16. And don't let them have social media until, I'm gonna mess up the ages, but it's regarding those things, you know? Because it has a really, really bad effect, especially on young elementary and middle school children. It does terrible things to their brains. And it's like proven, it makes them very unhappy.
And family union.
And family, yeah. Just conversation in general, you know? And then you think as a mom, okay, I need to be able to get in touch with my kid, or I want to be able to track where they are. And there are ways to do that without giving them a smartphone. You know, you don't have to go there. And then it's hard too as a parent because the friends in school have a phone and your kid's coming to you and being like, well, they have, you know, and you just gotta be. Even before this book came out, there was this one family at my school, and the dad was just super tough. I'm still friends with that family, and I just saw this guy, and he was just like a real, just like stickler, you know? A good dad, but like a real stickler. And his poor girls, four kids, 2 girls, 2 boys, his poor girls graduated from high school with BlackBerries. You know, and they're like trying to show me pictures on their phone, and they have to push like 7 buttons and be like, here it is, Dr. O'Toole is the picture, and their dad's just like, yeah. But I could tell from the way that those girls were, like if you had asked me as the school principal to tell you which kids in the high school did not have smartphones, I could tell you without talking to them. You can see it in the way they behave. So there you go. That's my opinion on smartphones. Yes, ma'am.
So we get the question quite frequently, and even in talking to other people that I'm trying to encourage to come to the school because of the positive experience our daughter is having, I get a lot of people that say, you don't use technology. How is that going to be detrimental to my child in their learning? Because in the public schools and in the Catholic schools and in other Christian schools, you know, it has taken over the classroom in some instances, but you know, they're fearful their kid will fall behind if they're
Yeah.
not utilizing technology in a classroom.
Yeah, and that's common. I mean, you want your kid to be prepared, right? You want your kid to be prepared for life. And so sometimes you think there's some skill that they need to learn while they're little and living under my roof so that they don't get caught behind. And that's true. But you just have to pick the right things for them to learn. You know, when I was, so 10 years ago when my school started, it was Austin, Texas, and so there was a Dell headquarters, an Apple headquarters, and a Microsoft headquarters right there. So there's all these like techie parents who are like technology people. And all of their questions were about that kind of thing. Like, are you going to offer coding, you know, for my child? Because in my profession, everyone needs to know how to do that. And I just can't even imagine an 18-year-old graduating from high school and not being able to do that thing. 10 years later, people don't need to know coding anymore. Not to that extent. It's all done automatically now, you know? So that's an example of a skill that seems to be like the most important thing quickly being dispensed with. And that's the problem with trying to like prepare your kids for, you know, the rapidly changing technological world. The specific technology that they're going to have available to them is going to change. And anyway, that's not even the deepest question about technology. Right? The deepest questions about technology, I think, right now are moral questions. Like everyone has AI now. As of what, like a year ago? Suddenly we have the ability to, you know, access computers who can do all of our writing for us if we want. Have we thought through what that means? You know, in what way will that be good for us? In what way will that be bad for us? And how will we become the kind of people who know the difference between those things? And so that's a classical education. It will prepare you to answer those questions. And then all of the latest and greatest whatever, how to go onto ChatGPT and get it to do something for you, they will figure out. It is not hard. It is built to be intuitive. Yes, sir. Or yes, ma'am.
Where does the skill of typing come into all of this? Because obviously, no technology in the classroom, but if they're going to write great papers,
Typing's great.
But when is that going to introduce, or is that even part of the classical curriculum, the skill of typing?
So that's a question for Mr. Gibson.
Okay.
I don't know at this school, but we've done at Leander at my old school and in many of the Hillsdale schools, they have done typing clubs or something. You know, you have to think about the amount of time that it takes to learn to type and the amount of instruction that's required. It's a skill that is developed over time through practice. And so it might not rise to the level of like an academic class, like history or something, but it's good to learn to do it. I learned using Mavis Beacon typing back in the ancient times.
Would you say that classical education is for every child and all abilities, or?
Yes, very much so. And this is a real misconception. I think it's getting better now as classical schools become more common. But when my school started, there were a lot of people who thought, that school's not for me, you know, and they're not for my child, because my child has struggled with whatever academic disability, or my child's never really liked school, or my child's more of a math person than a letters person. This is an education for human beings. And it takes its bearings from our common human nature. And the things that it teaches are the things that every human being needs to know in order to live a full and happy life. And so it is for every child. And I personally have seen I mean, I used to teach at my school. My theory was that the first graduating class needed to be good. And they were not when we started, because these kids came in as 10th graders and a lot of them just had never learned anything about anything before. And so my solution, maybe it was arrogant, but it was something I could control, was to teach them myself. I was like, I'm going to teach these kids for 3 years straight, and I'm just going to teach the subject that they need, and I'm going to hold them accountable and make it happen. And that class, those 15 kids, that was the widest range of abilities in a group of students I've ever seen. The smartest kid I've ever taught, including college, was in that class. And by smart, I mean raw intelligence, brain power. And she had an amazing work ethic and was an excellent human being and thoughtful about her character on top of that. But she just had extremely high thinking ability. And then there were kids who were not only poorly prepared for school because they hadn't received instruction in areas where they needed instruction in order to be 10th graders, but they also struggled with reading or with math or something. Some of them had disabilities. And you can teach that range in a classical setting at the same time and do a good job if you're an excellent classical teacher. And I was not excellent in those days, but I was okay. And I was able to help them understand important things that everyone needs to know, despite the fact that this one is going to get a certain type of question and this one is going to get a certain type of question. It is not elitist it's elitist in that it's an excellent curriculum. It's the best curriculum. It's the best approach to teaching. But if we tell ourselves that it is not for a certain type of student, we're doing a disservice to those students, and I think to ourselves as teachers. If you're a really good teacher, you can teach anyone. Am I doing okay, Mr. Gibson? Okay, thanks. Yes, sir.
So there's a substantial homeschooling community here in Columbus, especially with a lot of COVID stuff. So
Yeah.
how would you articulate the benefits of this type of education in this environment to folks that are kind of trying to do this at home, oftentimes classically, and maybe are struggling with that idea, making that move?
I think it's the parents' decision whether to send their child to school or homeschool them. And I don't advocate for one over the other. I think that it's the parents' call. I have seen a lot of students who were previously homeschooled transfer into classical schools. And what I have learned from that is that homeschooling can be done beautifully and homeschooling can be done very poorly. And so it's like a school, right? Except it's dependent on a couple of people. And so the quality of it depends on the ability of those people to do it well. Some of the best educated kids that ever transferred into my school had been educated at home for most of their K through 8 years by the woman who's now the assistant headmaster at Hillsdale Academy. And she is an amazing teacher. And they are very well-educated boys because she knew what she was doing. And so it can be excellent. But if it's not excellent, they should go to school, a good school, that will do right by the kids.
How do we offer comparison, given that we have kind of an internal testing system? So if you're talking, comparing schools one to another, obviously there's a competitive nature to that does matter for enrollment and recruiting, that sort of thing.
Yeah.
Since, students here are taking a CLT as opposed to, a state standardized test or some other system, how do you offer kind of a solid comparison?
Yeah, good question. So testing is not bad if the test is measuring the right things. And the argument against much state standardized testing is that it is not measuring the right things. What are the right things to measure? well, first of all, you have to divide what you're learning in school into the things that are measurable and the things that are not measurable. So things that are measurable would include reading fluency, you know, ability to decode English words, understanding of mathematical concepts, and things like that. And those are the things that are measured on many state tests. And students in classical schools do very, very well on those measures as compared to traditional public schools. I think that's an area where measuring is very helpful. We have a school in Indiana called Seven Oaks, and in the state of Indiana, there's a test called the I-Ready 3, I believe it's called. And the state average on that test is like 80%. And the third graders at Seven Oaks got 100% on that test, which means every single kid in that class can read. And the district went back to them and said, there's an error on your test reporting. You need to correct that. And they said, no, there's no error. They can read, you know? So we should measure that, you know, and we should be confident in that because they need to know those things. There are things that cannot be measured. I think that in order to be a classically educated human being, you need to have read and understood Moby Dick. How am I going to assess your knowledge of Moby Dick? Well, I couldn't really do it with a test. I could try. I could test some things about Moby Dick through a test. But really, I would have to have someone who knows Moby Dick well have a conversation with you and figure out if you are thinking about that book correctly. And that conversation should keep in mind the fact that that's not the kind of thing that one would master in life, right? Like there's some things in school that you have to master. You need to master your multiplication tables and just know them by heart. But there are some things that you wouldn't want to master. You would want to continue wondering about them for the length of your life. And if you meet someone who's like, I have completed 11th grade and I have mastered Moby Dick, that is not an appropriately curious human being. That person has failed to understand Moby Dick and should read it again with more humility so as to learn more from it. And so those are the kinds of things that even a test like the CLT isn't going to measure, and we shouldn't pretend to be able to measure. But we should strive for them and hold ourselves accountable to achieving them. The classical ed movement has not done enough work to demonstrate its success. It is obviously successful every time you walk around an excellent classical school, that more learning is happening there than in a less quality school, a lower quality school. But the classical education world needs to get a lot better at proving that outside to people who are not going to be able to walk around or who are not going to be looking for the right things.
One more question if anybody has one, but I want to be respectful of Dr. O'Toole's time. It's almost 5 o'clock. Anybody have one final question?
Yes, sir?
Yeah. This is more of a comment than anything. I'm not aware of all of the subject matter that's taught in the classical education environment. But someone asked a question about faith and classical education. I believe that the two definitely should be separated. Parents should direct the children, encourage the children to have a good faith education within their church, whatever their faith is. But I also think that in the education area outside of the church, there should probably be an education on the different primary religions of the world. Because I understand that there's people from different religions that attend a classical school, education school. And I think they need to develop a respect for the other person's education. But I don't know Is that part of?
It is very much.
Okay.
So there's there's a professor out of the University of Virginia, and his name is E.D. Hirsch, Hirsch, and he wrote a book in the 80s called Cultural Literacy. And the idea behind the book is there's a lot of information that students need to have learned in school or elsewhere in order to get along in the world as adults. When people make references to things, children need to have received the education that will help them make sense of those references. And so if I say to you, a stitch in time saves 9, you should know what I'm talking about. You know, if I say to you, Thomas Jefferson's Monticello, you should have something that comes into your mind. And if you don't have an image that comes into your mind, there's a gap in your education. Hirsch's book ends with an index of cultural literacy, and it's a list, many pages long, of terms like that. And after that book, something called the Core Knowledge Foundation was created, and it produced a scope and sequence for kindergarten through 8th grade schools that helped make sure that all of those facts and figures, all of those items were taught to a child. And in the early days of Hillsdale schools, we made use of that core knowledge sequence. We've since built upon it and created our own, which has, I think, higher ends than merely just helping students like know what you're talking about when you're saying something. I mean, ultimately, we want to be able to like think about higher things and have the right questions posed to us, not merely just like pick up on references. But you do need to be able to pick up on references. And so when someone tells you the 7 pillars of Islam, you should know what that is, even if you're not yourself a Muslim. When someone talks to you about the name of the yarmulke, the Jewish hat, you should know what is that? Who wears that? Why do they wear it? You know, just to get along in the world. And so as a student following this curriculum, you know, you would learn about all of the major world religions and also historical too. I mean, you need to know some stuff about Zeus and Hera too, even though I haven't met anyone who still believes in them. I'm sure they exist. You know, but there's value in that knowledge, not just for getting along in the world, but for looking at different ways of understanding meaning in the world. So I agree with you very much. Yep. Thanks all for your time and attention. It's a pleasure to be here.